Hello, very beautiful community. We need to say a bit more about the way Putin is struggling to trust Trump. There is one thing that I've already articulated, we could perhaps talk about it again on the main channel because it's important, and that's that it's my analysis that there is a sense in which Putin is missing an important opportunity. If Putin acceded to Trump's advances, he would have an opportunity to partly reintegrate with the West and actually use that reintegration to accelerate and acceleratedly undermine Western democracies and Ukraine's stability. But that's a little bit too free and a little bit too imaginative and a little bit too risky for Putin to do. Putin is too conservatively corroded by overstay in power to do what to him would feel an under-supported move that would depend on sort of speculative contingency, something he can't take a risk on. We've articulated that already. So what do we need to add to it to understand Putin's inability to trust Trump? I think two things, each of which we've discussed, but we haven't added them to this picture of Putin's inability to take advantage of Trump's advances. The first is just the strength and the weakness of Western democracy. Putin knows that our democracies are in decline, but he also exaggerates the inevitability of that decline progressing into collapse. And perhaps he also exaggerates how far that decline has gone. But despite that, he still thinks we have semi-functioning democratic systems. They're sort of fraudulent for Putin. They're not really democratic because nothing is really democratic. You can't have genuine relations of opposition between politicians, for instance, in Putin's mind. Everybody is everybody else's ally or enemy. But somehow still there are all of these institutions in the West that compete, and they are a disgrace. They're out for themselves. They're not part of any justifiable set of checks and balances, but they're still there, and they are part of a plurality of political competition. So how the hell is he supposed to trust Trump when Trump is a victim, potentially, and imminently, of all of these institutional checks and balances? I can do something with Trump, Putin might think, but it'll be reset after the next election. And that is a very important element that induces caution in Putin about walking toward Trump. And that's extremely ironic. So that's a case of Putin thinking that, in some respects at least, Western democracy, whose inevitable collapse he's already celebrating, is currently too strong for him to trust Trump. There is then another element, which we've also discussed endlessly: Trump's personality and Trump's psychology and Trump's neurology. There is a very big video on the main channel about Trump's narcissism, which virtually all of you have seen. So Putin thinks that not only are these checks and balances still kind of active and they endanger anything he might arrive at with Trump, but he thinks that Trump is also spectacularly ill-disciplined and not properly thought out in his actions to challenge this institutional setup properly. He thinks Trump is better placed to do it now. Trump is trying more, so Putin welcomes Trump's authoritarian revolution. He feels some affinity for it. But he thinks that Trump is still a fragile actor in the context of the pluralistic mess of American politics. If Trump were like an Orban, Putin would be inclined to trust more, because an Orban version of Trump or a Putinite version of Trump could come to Putin and say, look, yes, I'm vulnerable to these institutions, and yes, I'm supposed to leave power in a certain period of time. But trust me, I'll be able to get a handle on all of this stuff. Trust me, whether it's going to be with me or with somebody else, what will follow will be a continuation of what you and I agree. So you can be assured that we can go for that. Trump can't even say that. And if he were to, of course, Putin couldn't trust him. So I think that's very, very important too. We've before talked about Putin's incapacity to act freely, to act imaginatively. We've talked about Putin's risk-averse tendencies. We've talked about his fear-driven conservatism in action. But now we also want to say Western democracy is too strong for him to trust Trump. Trump is too psychologically feeble to reassure Putin that he can get a handle on political pluralism in America. And of course, right, all of this new bit of analysis has to be put against the background of Putin still regarding political control over Ukraine as existential, which he did from the beginning. You might ask, how does what you've said about Putin being risk-averse and conservative square with a sort of spectacular historical bungee jump he engaged in Feb 2022? Well, it squares with it because Putin had some false views about Ukraine, but also because Putin thought that it was a necessary defensive act. He wasn't doing it out of luxury. He wasn't doing it out of sort of, a desire to polish the glory that his regime was attaining in future history books. He did it because it was an existential defensive move, which is to say that this war remains not fundamentally territorial for Putin. Putin is fundamentally not concerned with what he gains and what he loses in eastern Ukraine. He's concerned about it, but he's not fundamentally concerned about it. What he's fundamentally concerned about is political control over Ukraine, and that's why even a very advantageous territorial acquisition for Putin, where he gets more than any of us realistically expect he might, as of today, that would still be problematic for him, because he'd say, well, who is going to have oversight over what remains of Ukraine? And will any of that oversight belong to either me or actors who act in a way that is consistent with my interests, right? If the rest of Ukraine continues to drift toward the West, the only way that's acceptable for Putin is if the West drifts toward Putin politically. Then he'd accept Ukraine's Western drift. Then he would say, well, as the West is now full of Le Pens and Orbans and Farages, we can accept Ukraine turning west because, a kind of monarchist authoritarian ideology is taking place in the West anyway, and so the West is no longer quite the enemy it was before. But short of that, Putin needs a degree of political control over Ukraine because that's existential for his regime security. Quite how it's existential, we've discussed in the past, and I take that point quite far. I actually think Putin thinks that in a sense it's even physically existential for him, because if an independent Ukraine, no matter how much territory is chopped off in East Ukraine, if an independent Ukraine is around at a time when things get rocky for the Putin regime, it could somehow inflect what happens inside Russia, and therefore endanger not just Putin's regime, but Putin's life. So it's important that our analysis of Putin's psychological hesitancy to move toward Trump due to essentially psychological corruption through overstay in power, that Putin's still limited but decisive confidence in the presence of what we would call Western democracy, what he would just call pluralistic, multi-institutional competition, and then Putin's distrust in Trump's efficacy and Trump's capacity to sustain anything. These three are then complemented by the fact that Putin still hasn't detached himself from a kind of dependence on political control over Ukraine. So that's the picture I wanted to paint in a few more brushstrokes, adding in particular these elements about Trump's weakness in the face of US institutions in Putin's eyes, and Trump's psychological weakness. These are important factors that make it very difficult for Putin to move and take advantage of Trump's advances. I believe Putin is mistaken about this. I believe he has more to gain than to lose if he did this well. But luckily for us, for all of our spectacular lack of strategy, for all of our spectacular incompetence, we're dealing with intellectual and psychic decay in the Kremlin. So the Kremlin is not as able as it would be if it were fresh and alert to inflict a defeat on us. And a defeat on us for the Kremlin is, of course, the political collapse of democratic systems in the West. Lots of love, talk soon.